My guest this hour is Peter Pry. He is the Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. I invited him on to talk about the recent cyber attacks and the threat of future cyber attacks. There was that report of the hacking that was linked to Russia that apparently had been going on for a while. It was in the news for a few hours and then it just went away. However, this is an important issue that we rarely hear about. It's something that is only mentioned when something bad happens, which, of course, is too late. And that's the beauty of the conversations that I like to have. It's an opportunity to educate people about the seriousness of the threat and what is happening and what should be happening when nothing is being reported. So I start the interview by mentioning the recent cyber attack and asking Peter to describe what happened.
Well, we don't know exactly what took place, except that they've managed to penetrate our best defenses. You know, a system called Einstein that the government has spent billions of dollars on. And the Russians, if they're the ones who did it, although recently Microsoft says there's a second actor, so it could be a joint Russia-China operation. The bottom line is, after billions of dollars spent and standing up a special organization called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, they've managed to get into our system undetected for at least 9 months. Some people think it might have been for years, and basically have been roaming around through 18,000 entities, probably at least 200 departments and agencies of the U.S. government, plus the private sector. This includes organizations like the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which are responsible for the security of our electric grid, defense contractors that are making our most advanced weapons. And so for 9 months, they've been at least spying and learning about our vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities of our critical infrastructures. And we don't know the extent of the damage yet. It's still going on. You know, this is one of the things they're trying to figure out. Just how big is the scope of the attack? And what have they done? Are they just stealing information? Washington, every time this happens, like during the Obama administration back in 2015, when we had a big cyber attack from China that stole information on 20 million federal employees, that's basically the story that the government puts out, that they stole information. I'm not really fully trusting of that explanation. Because you see, there's a big difference between an intelligence operation. We all tolerate that. The United States collects intelligence against adversaries too, and it's not considered an act of war when you're just collecting intelligence. But if you're actually conducting cyber warfare, you know, what they could be doing, in addition to collecting intelligence, is inserting logic bombs, computer viruses, cyber bugs into the systems, so that at some future time, they can do things like black out the electric grid, stop our communications, paralyze the federal government so that it can't work. Are they doing that? I suspect they are. I think they probably did that during the Obama administration, and they're doing that again this time. But Washington doesn't want to admit it, because then it's an act of war, and you have to respond in some way. Every time this happens, Washington starts making all kinds of noises, all kinds of sound and fury about how this will not stand and they're going to retaliate. And then they don't do anything. They don't even increase our defenses. This is a new way of warfare that is outside the realm of the strategic imaginations of the Washington bureaucracies, the national defense establishments. And they're really in a quandary about how to respond. Also, I think it would be very dangerous for us to retaliate against adversaries. We're not even 100% sure it's Russia. That's one of the things about cyber warfare. Just finding out who attacked you is a hard technical problem. And when you really get down to the brass tacks of it, even right now, we're not 100% sure it was the Russians. The Iranians would love Russia and the United States to go to war, to have the two infidel powers wipe each other out. It could be a false flag operation where Iran or North Korea or some other terrorist actor, got in and did all kinds of damage. Although it's probably not terrorists, because the the intelligence community does think that this is a nation-state actor of some kind.
He mentioned Washington, and after the cyber attack was reported, Doug Schoen, a Democrat strategist and Fox News contributor, wrote an op-ed in response to the attack saying that it necessitates swift retaliation. Biden said Trump should have done more. Trump seemed to downplay it. And since he mentioned that, it's typical to try to downplay the threat, stating that the Obama administration did the same thing. I asked him why this is a typical reaction from Washington when things like this happen, and here's his response.
That's a big, tough question. I guess the 20,000-foot answer would be that every great civilization reaches an apex and then goes into a period of decline. Given modern technology, historical evolution is accelerating in terms of the way this happens. The America I grew up in was super competent. You know, we were able to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II. We invented the atomic bomb. We built a national highway system larger than that of the Roman Empire in a matter of a few years. We sent a man to the moon. You know, the U.S. government was competent. It had really good leaders and people who had actually done things with their lives, built private sector industries and inventions that were spectacular. Now we have had the experience, sort of like the late Roman Empire, where those super competent, that great generation has gone away. They've been retired, and we are being ruled by the third or fourth generation of government bureaucrats. You know, people who have never invented anything, people who never won a war, you know, people who basically their chief expertise is in covering their rear ends and making excuses. And we kind of can see this in what happened with the COVID-19 crisis. We've spent decades and billions of dollars supposedly preparing for serious biological warfare. Not something like COVID-19. The survival rate for COVID-19 is 99.987%. But genetically engineered anthrax, you know, has a mortality rate of 90%. And we were supposed to be prepared for something like that. That's why we have a National Institute for Health and a Center for Disease Control. And there's even an Assistant Secretary of Defense position for chemical and biological warfare that's supposed to be responsible for that. Yet, when the biological hit came, you know, we weren't prepared at all. A poster child for this, as I mentioned in the article, is Chris Krebs. Multiply Chris Krebs by 5,000, and that's the problem. You know, what was this guy doing in charge of the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA? This is the lead agency for protecting us against cyber threats. He was even supposed to be protecting the elections from manipulation by foreign actors. But who is Christopher Krebs? He came in during the Obama administration, so he's an Obama holdover, and President Trump promoted him. He promoted this guy to head CISA, so President Trump has to take responsibility for Chris Krebs too. And Christopher Krebs is a lawyer, and he was a former lobbyist for Microsoft, you know, which is one of the big high-tech companies like Google. And, you know, his job throughout most of his career has been to protect Microsoft and the big tech companies from government regulation. So you, in effect, had a lobbyist, you know, in charge of CISA, whose job was to do things like pass regulations to make the critical infrastructures, including the big high-tech companies, protect themselves. And he wasn't doing it. You know, he was continuing his duties as a lobbyist, basically, as the director of CISA. And at least he has the responsibility to admit that he was at fault, that he failed, and he did. But it was inevitable that he would fail because he doesn't have deep expertise in cyber or EMP. He's not a scientist or a technician. He's a lawyer and a lobbyist. What is he doing in charge of CISA? Multiply Chris Krebs by 5,000 times, and that's why we're vulnerable.
And this is a problem that I talk about a lot, about unelected bureaucrats being in control, the true people in control of the country. We don't know who they are. They have unlimited power. And in this particular case and many others, they're not really competent. Coming up, we'll continue our discussion on cyber attacks with Peter Pry. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine? Do you yawn when they speak of sunny
Welcome
Spain?
back to the show. We're discussing the threat of cyber attacks with Peter Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. Give us a call at 312-642-5600 and let us know your thoughts on cyber threats. Do you think more attention should be paid to the issue, or how do you think it should be addressed? When we left, Peter was talking about the problem being mismanaged by our leaders in Washington. Next, I asked him if he thought partisanship was part of the problem.
Yes, I would. That's another 20,000-foot view of the problem. In effect, are we really a constitutional republic anymore? A republic means that those elected representatives, the people in Congress, the president, that they have the responsibility, and they're supposed to take the responsibility for running the government. But we have this administrative state now, this huge bureaucracy that actually is the real entity in charge of running things. And the Congress only symbolically runs things. I'll bet not a single member of Congress has read that 5,000-page budget that they just passed. They enjoy their perks. They are, in essence, figureheads. Even the president, in a lot of ways, is really a figurehead. And President Trump, for example, much to his credit, signed a year ago. He signed an executive order to protect our critical infrastructures from the worst ultimate cyber weapon, which is the EMP, an EMP attack. And the Congress agreed with him, and in the National Defense Authorization Act. And I think this is the first time it happened in history. You had a presidential executive order directing the U.S. government to protect us from EMP. And then Congress, on a bipartisan basis, agreed in the National Defense Authorization Act and said, we agree with everything in this executive order. We're going to include it in our National Defense Authorization Act so that it also has the weight of law. It is now the law, U.S. government. Not only you have an executive order from the commander-in-chief telling you to do this, but we, the Congress, are saying you, as a matter of law, you shall also act on this and do it quickly. And nothing got done. A year after the executive order was passed, nothing has been done, to advance actually implement the EMP executive order. And Chris Krebs was in charge of that too. He was supposed to have the lead on doing that. And instead, he slow-rolled the executive order, lowballed the threats. One of the things that happens in Washington is that studies and conferences pass for action. So you can do another report, have a meeting. That's supposed to be an action. That's not an action in the view of the American people. What they expect to be done is surge arresters and Faraday cages and blocking devices to actually be installed into the electric grid, for example, so that it is actually protected. Not a single transformer or control system has actually been hardened in more than a year. And that could have been done. And it would have been done by the great generation that won World War II and sent a man to the moon. If Eisenhower or Kennedy had passed that executive order back in those days, and the Congress had passed a law and made it part of the National Defense Authorization Act, I'll bet in 1 year, at least 500 most important transformers that supply our major metropolitan areas where most of the American people live would probably have been protected by now. But yes, this is an example of what happens when you start losing a real constitutional republic and it starts sort of become fake figurehead positions. And the real governance is done by the administrative state.
And this is what you get when you give your friends jobs or repay political favors. Next, I asked Peter to tell us what the actual threat is and how vulnerable we are.
Well, the threat, and this is what Washington doesn't understand, and it's one of the things that makes retaliation so dangerous, is Russia, China, North Korea, basically they all have the same idea about what cyber warfare is. They call it by different names. information warfare, cyber warfare, electronic warfare, but it all boils down to the same thing. And all of their doctrines, while they vary a little, they're based on a book that was written, by a Russian general called No Contact Wars. And that's the blueprint. And the Chinese have their version of it. The North Koreans have their version of it. The Iranians also have their version of it. And basically, this book describes a revolutionary new way of warfare, the most decisive kind of war in history that combines what we understand as cyber attacks, which is cyber bugs and viruses and logic bombs. Okay. But in their view, it also includes other operations like a nuclear EMP attack and non-nuclear EMP weapons and physical sabotage, sending in teams of elite groups to actually shoot up transformers and sabotage control stations, so that with a small handful of people like that, all of these things combined, you can basically take down a power grid, for example, and that would cause all the other critical infrastructures to collapse. You can't have water. The food supply will start to spoil immediately when the electric grid goes down. No communications. EMP will cause cars to stop and airplanes to fall out of the sky and natural gas pipelines to explode. So all the critical infrastructures that make our electronic civilization run can basically be wiped out, so that the society becomes paralyzed in seconds with an EMP attack. Take longer with a cyber attack, but all of these things, and you could do it with any one of these things. The way their doctrine, the way it seems to work in their exercises and writings, is that it's a layered, sequential kind of an attack that starts with cyber, and then if they were actually to go to war, they'd try to shut everything down with just the cyber. But if that didn't work, and you can tell very quickly if you're going to succeed or not, then the next phase would be to throw in sabotage using non-nuclear EMP weapons, sort of like the Champ cruise missile that our U.S. Air Force has. You can actually Google the Champ at work and see it shutting down electric grids and damaging electronic components. And then the ultimate cyber weapon is a nuclear EMP attack, one weapon that would be detonated in space. It's not like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. If you were standing on the ground directly beneath the explosion, which is happening, maybe 100, 400 kilometers overhead in outer space, you wouldn't hear it. There'd be no blast that would reach the ground, no radioactive fallout, nothing like that. It creates this electromagnetic pulse, which is basically a super energetic radio wave that's got so much energy in it that would fry all the electronics in North America. And that's the ultimate cyber weapon that would for sure take everything down. And then you could decide if you want to fight World War III the old-fashioned way, with tank armies running over NATO, now that the United States is out of the picture, with nuclear missiles going to destroy our bombers on their bases and our missiles in their silos and destroy the ballistic missile submarines in port. And the Russians have actually exercised this. There was a big military exercise called Vostok 18, where hundreds of U.S. electric utilities were attacked about a month before Vostok 18 happened. And we were very alarmed about that at the time. Now, they didn't shut down the electric grid, but they demonstrated a capability to do it in Vostok 18. And then a month later, they had this, it might have been the largest military exercise in history. And it was a joint Russia-China military exercise that involved 300,000 troops, 1,000 aircraft, 36,000 tanks and armored fighting vehicles. So they played out the whole thing, from the cyber tip of the spear all the way to the regular nuclear conventional war back in 2018. And now I think they're doing it again, because these cyber attacks coincide with another big strategic forces exercise that was run by Vladimir Putin, where he actually live launched something like 5 ICBMs, sub-launched ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. And then they launched an anti-satellite missile, to attack our satellites. They're simulating World War III against the United States in all domains, in the cyber domain, in space, and in the terrestrial domain. And that's what Washington doesn't get. Washington looks at cyber attacks and thinks of them narrowly as just cyber, and they're not connected to these other operations. And that's why if you retaliated against an enemy who's thinking differently than we are and sees this as a joint kind of an operation, you could blunder into a World War III the way the West blundered into World War I by inadvertently escalating the situation. And that's one of the most dangerous things, the fact that this new way of warfare is not understood by Washington. It's outside their strategic imaginations, the way Pearl Harbor was outside of our strategic imagination.
Yeah, and I wanted to know why no one was talking about this, as important as it sounds, but if Washington's not and the media's not, why would anybody know about it? More with Peter Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are getting educated on cyber attacks and the potential threat with Peter Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. And I followed up his last points by asking, since we're in the middle of the pandemic, if he felt the COVID response highlighted our lack of preparedness, and what, do we do about that?
Certainly. And it proves that all of our much vaunted biological warfare preparedness is not there. I am sure that they're going to be investing very heavily in future biological weapons. And I guess if you extrapolate from that, I guess they would say, well, look, these guys, after billions of dollars and decades of supposedly getting ready for biological warfare, they're not competent, they're not capable. They were caught by surprise, even by COVID-19, which isn't really a serious threat. I mean, it is not a serious biological weapon. Our overreaction to COVID-19 has done far more damage than the virus itself would have done if we just did nothing. And from that, they can say, well, look, these guys aren't prepared for COVID-19. They're certainly not going to be prepared for cyber and EMP attacks and this new way of warfare. So from that point of view, yes, absolutely. And I've written about that as well, that looking at how incompetent our elites are and our government has become, it's got to heighten their confidence that they could win a World War III. And maybe this is the time. I'm sure that they must be thinking that a great debate is going on in the general staffs of all of our adversaries about, is this the time to strike? When America is at its nadir, and their cyber weapons are demonstrating great superiority to us. We haven't been able to defend ourselves effectively against them, even though it shouldn't be that hard. I mean, we know what to do.
Oh, so let's get to that. That's the next question. What do we do to prepare?
Well, what we should do is they should follow the recommendations of the Marsh Commission that was stood up during the Clinton administration 23 years ago. They should listen to the Defense Science Board that did an excellent study back in 2013 and had excellent recommendations. And for 17 years, the EMP Commission, the last EMP Commission report was delivered to the White House and to Congress back in 2017. And I think it's the best of all the studies that provided a roadmap for how do we protect ourselves against this threat. And technologically, there are hardware solutions to the worst case cyber threats. The kinds of things you do to protect against EMP can also protect against worst case cyber. By putting surge arresters and Faraday cages and blocking devices on transformers and control systems. So that they would survive an EMP attack or a worst case cyber attack. For example, the worst case scenario is using a cyber attack to black out the national election. And how would that be done by cyber means? Well, you'd use a cyber bug that would get into the SCADAs, the Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems. These are little computers. They're everywhere. They run everything. You'd get the cyber bug in there, and the cyber bug would change the way the electricity flows into a big transformer, because those transformers are designed. Every transformer is unique, and the electricity going through the transformer has to come into it in the same way all the time. Now, if you change that, if you alter that even a little bit, eventually it'll burn the transformer out. So that's what the cyber bug would do. It would get this data to change the way the electricity flows through a transformer, for example, and it would burn out the transformer. And then the load from that transformer has to go somewhere. I mean, these big extra high voltage transformers typically carry 500,000 to 750,000 volts. And suddenly, when that transformer goes out, that load gets dumped on neighboring transformers, and they can't handle the load, and they fail. And then that load has to go somewhere. So you can get through a cyber attack just by attacking a few transformers. You could end up causing a cascading failure that knocks out all 2,000 extra high voltage transformers and puts the whole country into a permanent blackout, after which 90% of the population could die from starvation, disease, and societal collapse in a year. So how do we protect against that? Well, you have a surge arrestor on the transformer so that if the electricity is coming in a waveform that doesn't look right, it stops it. That's what a surge arrestor does. And so you can't destroy the transformer that way by cyber. And the same thing would happen with EMP. And so that simple hardware solution would protect you against the worst case scenarios for both cyber and EMP and physical sabotage too. How can a handful of saboteurs take out the electric grid? Well, if you had 9 guys with rifles or rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and take out some small percentage of those transformers, you're going to start the same process happening again. But again, the surge arrestor will stop that. Now, I thought that this is such a common sense thing. This is so simple to do. It doesn't even cost that much money, that we thought that in a couple of years, the government would do it and we could forget about this problem, that the grid would be protected. But here it is, 2020. It's 12 years after we made the recommendations, and nothing has been done. We don't have a single surge arrestor on any of the transformers. We don't have a Faraday cage or a blocking device installed on any of the parts of the grid. And
So why aren't they listening?
Because you've got people like Christopher Krebs in charge of the U.S. government who don't know anything about these things.
More with Peter Pry. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing the threat of cyber attacks with Peter Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. And at the end of the last segment, Peter mentioned that we have people in charge who don't know what they're doing. And this just keeps going back to what I call the problem of the unelected bureaucrat. The people who run the government. I talked earlier about appointing people as political favors, payback for people getting you elected. But we know that happens. But what seems weird about it is even in any event, if that happens, he says that the people should be listening to the experts. We should be following the science. So, but you would think that somebody who gets that role for whatever reason would still be like, I'm protecting the country. If they're saying this is a problem, we should at least address it. So I ask him why they aren't doing so.
We are supposed to be, and in the old days we would. But, the biggest problem is not the technology. We know how to... The Department of Defense, for example, which is one of the few parts of our government that still works, they've been very good about protecting their systems against EMP because they're war fighters and they think that way. But you've also got this problem of corruption, within the government, deep corruption. For example, in order for CISA to get anything done, they've got to persuade the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to pass a regulation to say, you guys in the electric power industry, you are going to start protecting your grids. We want you to put these surge arresters on the transformers. Now, FERC hasn't done that, and it won't do it. And why is that? Because all 9 FERC commissioners are lawyers and former lobbyists for the electric power industry. They see their job as protecting the industry from onerous regulations and things of that sort. Sometimes, there's a bright spot. I mean, Cheryl LaFleur, who was a Democrat. She was a Democrat commissioner. that was appointed to the FERC. But when she first came in, it looked like she was going to be a warrior for making it happen. And we did make a little progress when Cheryl LaFleur was there, and so that an EMP can also be caused by the sun. All right. There are these geomagnetic superstorms that can create a natural EMP that can actually knock out all the electric grids all over the entire world, like in the 1859 Carrington event. And she was concerned about that, in addition to the nuclear EMP and the non-nuclear EMP weapons. And at least thanks to her, we did get a new standard where they're supposed to be protecting themselves against the natural EMP from the sun. It's called a GMD standard, which stands for geomagnetic disturbance. But the standard is set so low that it's meaningless, okay? They only have to protect themselves to something like 8 volts per kilometer, when it should be 24 to 30 volts per kilometer. So the standard is set so low that the utilities don't have to do anything. And it's this kind of gamesmanship and basically corruption, that these people, they don't see themselves as working for the American people and for the nation. They came from the industry. They were working for the industry. When they leave the FERC, they're going to go back to the industry. They don't want to give up those very high paying jobs, and force the industry to do something it doesn't want, because then they're going to alienate their future employer, who's going to richly reward them for the service that they've provided on the FERC. So corruption is a very serious part of it. And also there's ideological issues as well that, the far left, has this misconception that EMP is a Republican obsession, all right, which is not true. But they like to think that because it's easy to belittle people who are concerned about the EMP threat as wearing tinfoil on their heads and being overly concerned about something that isn't really a threat. That's just in a highly politicized system where we like to mock each other and not take each other seriously. It's when you have an argument or a caricature that you can impose upon your adversary that gives you political advantage, it's just too good to give up, even if it's putting the nation at danger,
So it's shocking to me that this is an issue that gets so little airplay. We don't know what other countries are having the works, but obviously if there was a recent cyber attack, they're doing something. Like he said earlier, we don't know. Maybe they're just, coming in to see what we have and get information, or maybe they're trying to see if they can do something greater. So we talk about precautions all the time on all these other issues. Why wouldn't we, spend a small amount of money, relative to the budget to shore up these things? Why isn't this an issue? And then every time something happens, they all clamor and say, oh no, we got to do something. Why wouldn't we be protecting our grid? It seems weird that, we don't hear anything about it. It may be that, like he said, some of the people who are in charge are beholden to the companies. It may just be that we're so focused on all these other things that are less important, but they maintain our focus because they get they have the squeakiest wheels. Maybe we're trying to, fix racism or, make sure there's enough women everywhere, and that, supersedes any other problems that we may be facing. But coming up, we have our final segment with Peter Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. You make me feel so sweet.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
I need a dollar, that's what I need.
Welcome back. This is our last segment with Peter Pry, and I asked him, what is the solution? I think it's going to take the American people pressuring the politicians, but how can that happen if we are uninformed? Here's his response.
Well, I think the American people, well, it's not a majority, There is an activist minority of Americans. There are a lot of nonprofits around, for example, that are dedicated to trying to advance cyber security and EMP security. And hopefully Republicans and Democrats alike can wake up to the fact that we have strayed so far from the Constitution, from the vision the founders had of how our society is supposed to work, that we really need to get back to basics, not just to preserve our freedom, but to preserve our lives. I've written a book called Blackout Wars that talks about state initiatives. All the solutions for this, even for this, don't have to come from Washington. The solutions can come from state and local governments. If state governments decide to protect the electric grids within their states, they can do that. The governors have homeland security powers. The state legislatures have regulatory authorities over the electric grids that exist within their states. Townships and communities can think through, well, what do we need to do to protect our critical assets from cyber attacks and EMP? What do we need to do to survive? So in the vacuum that's been left, by this incompetency revolution that has happened in Washington, the state and local governments can step into it. And if they do that, it can set a precedent where state and local governments can start making decisions and providing solutions to other problems that we have up until this point increasingly relied upon Washington to do. Washington should never have been doing most of what it's doing now anyway. That's not how our government was supposed to set up. Most governance is supposed to be happening at the local and state levels, at levels of government that are closer to the lives of the people and where people have more control over it. So this could be the very fact that Washington doesn't work on EMP or actually on anything. Maybe this will become an opportunity for a second American revolution, a peaceful revolution where the states and localities and the people themselves take back control over their own lives and simply say, look, Washington, we're not waiting for you to solve these problems. We're going to take our fates in our own hands, and we're going to solve these problems at the state and local level. And that would be transformative. It would get us back to the constitutional republic that we're supposed to have. That's a tall order to happen, but I think it's what has to happen if we're going to survive and if we're going to remain free. We either have to have a second American revolution that gets freedom and gives people back the control over their own lives, or we are going to just continue to see more of the same thing with our enemies getting more and more confident that they can attack us. And God forbid, at some point it's going to actually happen, just the way it happened in World War II. We know how to do it. It's the political problem for addressing cyber and EMP threats, this new way of warfare. That's the problem. That's why we haven't been able to solve it for more than 20 years. It's the politics of cyber and EMP warfare that is so resistant to solutions.
I think that's a great place to leave it. He is Peter Pry, Executive Director of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. Thank you so much, and I would love to have you back.
Well, I'd love to come back. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk about this esoteric but extremely important subject.
I think this was really important because these are kind of things I want to bring up, issues that are important but no one talks about.